They told her honesty was a luxury for people who could afford supper, but Clara Whitfield had nothing except honesty and an empty stomach. The morning began with the sound of a screen door slamming somewhere down the dirt road and the dry Wyoming wind pushing dust like whispers across the street. And Clara stood outside the general store with one thin silver coin pressed into her palm, enough for a small loaf of bread or a cup of beans if Mr. Hargrove was feeling generous. But instead of stepping inside, she kept staring at the object wrapped carefully in a scrap of faded blue cloth, a ring she had found half buried near the horse trough where the sun had caught its edge just enough to shine, like a signal meant only for her. Clara was 14, small for her age, with quiet gray eyes that rarely met anyone else's and hair the color of dry wheat tied back with a piece of twine, because ribbons cost money, and money was something she had learned not to expect from the world. People in town called her polite when they noticed her at all, which was rare, and shy when they did, which was easier than saying invisible. The ring was heavier than it looked, cool even in the morning heat, silver wrapped around a small turquoise stone marked with scratches that told a story she did not know. And when Mr. Hargrove saw it in her hand, he leaned forward across his counter and said he could give her $5 for it. Maybe 7 if she didn't ask questions, enough to feed her for a week, maybe 2, enough to buy a blanket without holes, enough to make winter feel less like a test. Clara only shook her head and asked who it might belong to. And when he shrugged, she nodded once like she had already made the decision somewhere deep inside long before hunger had a chance to argue. The walk south toward Apache territory was almost 6 miles if you followed the creek and closer to 8 if you stayed on the safe road. And Clara chose the longer road because she had learned that doing the right thing usually took longer. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat into her shoulders, her worn boots kicking small stones with every step, and more than once she slowed, looking back toward town where food and safety waited if she simply decided this wasn't her responsibility. But each time her fingers tightened around the cloth bundle, and she kept moving. A hawk circled overhead, grass bent in slow waves. Somewhere far off a horse snorted. By the time she reached the line where the open prairie gave way to scattered cottonwood trees, her throat was dry, and her courage felt smaller than when she started. But she stepped forward anyway, because no one had ever taught her bravery, and yet somehow she had it. She did not know that 3 riders had already seen her from a ridge half a mile away. She did not know that by sunrise the next morning her name would be spoken by people who had never noticed she existed. And she did not know that a simple choice made by a hungry girl on a quiet American morning was already changing the direction of her life, like a railroad switch turning steel toward a different horizon. By the time Clara reached the first line of cottonwood trees, the air felt different, cooler somehow, carrying the faint smell of sage and wood smoke, and she knew without anyone telling her that she had stepped into land where she was the outsider. She slowed her steps, not because anyone had stopped her, but because respect felt like the right speed here. The cloth bundle felt heavier now, not from weight, but from meaning, and she brushed dust from her worn dress with nervous hands before stepping forward again. A branch cracked somewhere to her left. She stopped. The prairie had been full of sound before, wind and insects and distant birds, but here the quiet felt intentional, like someone holding their breath. When the first rider appeared, he did not come fast or loud. He simply stepped out from between the trees like he had always been there. Then another, then a third. None of them raised a weapon. None of them spoke. Their horses stood calm and tall, leather reins decorated with small beads that clicked softly when the animals shifted their weight. Clara felt her heartbeat in her throat, but she did not run. Running would mean guilt. She had nothing to be guilty for. One of the riders, a man with long dark braids touched with gray, studied her with patient eyes that did not look angry, only careful. His voice when he spoke was steady and clear. He asked why she had come this far alone. Clara swallowed and held out the wrapped cloth with both hands like an offering. She said she believed something had been lost, and she thought it should be found again. The man did not take it immediately. Instead, he watched her face as if measuring something deeper than her words. Another rider circled slowly behind her, not threatening, just certain. Clara kept her eyes forward. Finally, the older man accepted the bundle and unfolded the cloth. The silver caught the afternoon light. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. The man drew in a slow breath, and something changed in his expression, not surprise exactly, something quieter, something heavier. He spoke a few words in his own language, and the other riders straightened slightly in their saddles. Clara worried she had done something wrong. She explained quickly that she had not wanted payment and had not told anyone she was coming because she did not want anyone to stop her. The older man looked back at her and asked if she had eaten that day. The question caught her off guard. She admitted she had not. He nodded once and reached into a saddlebag, offering her a small piece of dried meat and a tin cup of water. Clara hesitated only a second before accepting, whispering thank you like it mattered more than the food. After she finished, he gestured back toward the open prairie and told her she should return home before dark. Clara nodded, relieved, thinking the moment was over, just a small right thing done in a large, quiet world. She did not notice the way the three riders watched her walk away. She did not see the older man close his hand carefully around the ring, as if holding something that had traveled through many years to find its way back. And she did not hear him say softly, almost to himself, that some debts arrive without warning and must be answered before the next sunrise. Clara reached the edge of town just as the last light settled low over the rooftops, turning the windows gold and the long dirt street into a ribbon of copper dust, and nothing about the place suggested that anything important had happened that day, which felt right to her because she had never believed her choices mattered much to anyone but herself. A wagon rolled slowly past her, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of flour sacks, and the driver did not look down at her as she stepped aside. He never did. Most people did not. Clara returned to the small shack she called home at the far edge of town, where the grass grew thin and the fence posts leaned like tired men. The door creaked the same way it always did when she pushed it open, and inside everything waited exactly as she had left it. One narrow bed, one chair with a cracked leg, one small iron stove that had not seen firewood in 2 days. She placed her empty tin cup on the small table even though she knew there was nothing to fill it with and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her boots off slowly, her feet sore from the miles, but her mind strangely calm. Hunger was still there, a quiet ache, but something else sat beside it now, something steadier. She told herself she had done what was right. That had to be enough. Outside, night settled in with the distant sound of coyotes calling across the plains and the soft knocking of loose shutters somewhere down the road. Clara lay down fully dressed beneath her thin blanket and watched moonlight trace pale lines across the ceiling boards. For the first time in many nights, her thoughts did not circle around worry. Instead, she remembered the older rider's question about whether she had eaten and the way his voice had carried concern without pity. That part stayed with her longer than the food itself. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped the way it always did out on the prairie, the kind of cold that slipped through walls and reminded people how small they really were. But Clara slept anyway, tired enough to trust tomorrow would look like yesterday. Before dawn, the town was still, the sky just beginning to turn from black to deep blue, when a distant rhythm began to move through the ground like a quiet drum. Hoofbeats. Not fast. Not loud. Steady. Clara did not hear them at first. Few people did. But old Mrs. Delaney across the road heard them when she rose early to start her coffee fire, and she froze with her kettle in her hand as dark shapes emerged slowly through the morning mist. Riders. Many of them. They did not shout. They did not rush. They simply arrived, one after another, horses breathing clouds into the cold air as they formed a silent line along the edge of town. By the time the sun touched the horizon, there were more than 20. No one understood why they had come. No one understood why they stopped in front of the smallest house at the far edge of the street. And inside that house, Clara Whitfield was still asleep, unaware that by the time she opened her eyes, the world outside her door would no longer see her as invisible. Clara woke to a sound she did not recognize at first. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, like rain that had forgotten how to fall, and when she opened her eyes, the morning light was already touching the edges of her window frame, pale and cold and different from other mornings. She sat up slowly, her blanket falling from her shoulders, and for a moment everything felt normal until she noticed the silence. No wagons, no voices, no hammer from the blacksmith shop. Even the usual barking dogs had gone quiet. That was what made her stand. She stepped into her boots without lacing them and moved toward the door, her fingers hesitating on the handle as if something on the other side might change everything once seen. When she opened it, the cold air touched her face first. Then she saw them. Horses stood in a long, quiet line across the open ground in front of her small home, their breath rising in soft white clouds, leather saddles creaking softly as they shifted. Men sat straight in those saddles, calm and patient, their dark eyes not threatening, not demanding, simply waiting. Clara felt her throat tighten. She counted without meaning to. 5, 10, 15, more than 20. The same older rider from the day before sat at the center, his posture unchanged, his expression carrying the same calm gravity she remembered. Behind her, she heard doors opening across the street, curtains lifting, whispered guesses moving through the cold air like dry leaves. Some believed she had done something wrong. Some believed she was about to be taken away. Clara did not move backward. She stepped outside, barely 5 feet tall, standing in worn boots and a faded dress. She looked smaller than ever against the line of riders, but she kept her hands still at her sides because fear, she had learned, did not help a person stand straighter. The older man dismounted slowly, boots touching the dirt with deliberate care, and the other riders remained mounted, a quiet show of respect rather than force. He walked toward her until only a few steps separated them. Up close, she could see the fine lines time had written around his eyes and the turquoise bead woven into his braid. He studied her face again like he had the day before, searching not for answers, but for truth. From inside his coat, he removed the silver ring and held it between his fingers where the morning sun could find it. Clara felt her breath pause. He asked if she understood what she had returned. Clara answered honestly that she did not. He nodded slowly, as if that answer mattered more than any other. Around them the town watched without speaking. Then he asked her a question so simple it almost felt out of place in such a serious moment. He asked why she had chosen to do what she did when no one would have known if she had not. Clara looked at the ground for a second, then back at him, and said the only answer she had. She said that being unseen did not mean she should become someone she could not respect. The man held her gaze a long moment. Something in the air shifted. Not louder, not dramatic, just different. And in that quiet morning, surrounded by horses and silence and watchful eyes, it became clear that this was not a visit about a lost ring. It was about the kind of person who returns one. The older man listened without interruption, his face unreadable in the early light. And when Clara finished speaking, he turned the ring slowly between his fingers as if measuring the weight of something far greater than silver. He told her that the stone set in that ring came from a place his people considered sacred, a place where promises were made and never spoken of lightly, and that many winters ago it had belonged to someone who believed that trust between strangers was the rarest kind of wealth. Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and somehow that seemed to be the correct answer. The chief nodded once, almost to himself, then asked if she understood what most people would have done if they had found something worth more than everything they owned. Clara admitted she did. He asked if she had ever owned anything worth protecting. She thought for a long moment before answering that a person does not need to own something to know it does not belong to them. A few of the riders behind him exchanged quiet glances. The chief stepped slightly to the side and looked at her small house, the crooked roof line, the empty woodpile, the worn hinges on the door, details most people passed without seeing. He asked how long she had lived alone. She told him 3 years. He asked who looked after her. She answered that no one did, but that she had learned how to look after herself. The answer seemed to settle something unspoken among the riders. The chief then said something unexpected. He said that returning the ring was not the important part. Anyone could return something if they hoped to gain favor. What mattered was that she had expected nothing, that she had walked away believing the story was finished. Clara felt confused by that. She said she had only done what felt right. The chief gave a faint smile that did not show in his mouth, but in his eyes. He said that was exactly what he had hoped she would say. From a small leather pouch, he removed a thin braided cord and tied the ring to it before holding it out toward her again. Clara hesitated, unsure why he would give it back. He explained that among his people a returned object sometimes chooses its next keeper, not as payment, not as reward, but as recognition. Clara shook her head softly and said she could not accept something so valuable. The chief replied that value was not always measured in dollars. Sometimes it was measured in character. He told her she was free to refuse, and that refusal would also be respected. Clara looked at the ring, then at the line of riders, then back at the chief. She said quietly that she did not need anything. The chief nodded again, as if this answer mattered most of all. Then he asked one more question, softer than the others, a question that caused even the watching townspeople to lean closer without realizing it. He asked her what she believed a person should do when the world gives them nothing. Clara thought carefully before answering. She said she believed they should still try to be someone who gives something back. For the first time, the chief lowered his head slightly toward her, not as a gesture of authority, but of respect. And in that moment, even the morning wind seemed to pause as if it understood that something unseen had just changed. The chief remained still for several long seconds after Clara spoke, as if her words had confirmed something he had suspected but needed to hear spoken aloud. And when he finally moved, it was with the quiet certainty of a man making a decision that had nothing to do with chance. He placed the ring back into the leather pouch instead of offering it again, and said that sometimes the greatest test of a person was not whether they would take a reward, but whether they would remain the same person after refusing one. Clara did not fully understand what he meant, but she listened carefully because something in his tone suggested this was not the end of the conversation. Around them, the town had begun to gather more openly now, boots crunching on frost-hardened dirt, murmurs rising like distant whine through dry grass. But no one stepped closer than the invisible line formed by the waiting riders. The chief asked Clara if she could read. She answered that she could read a little, enough to understand letters and store signs, because a schoolteacher had once let her sit near the back of a classroom during winter months when there was nothing else for her to do. He asked if she could sew. She nodded. Mend clothes, patch blankets, fix worn cuffs. He asked if she was afraid of hard work. Clara almost smiled at that, and said she had never been given a reason to fear it. The chief seemed satisfied. He told her that his people believed character revealed itself in small choices long before it ever appeared in large ones, and that yesterday she had made a small choice that spoke very loudly. Clara lowered her eyes slightly, not from shame but from uncertainty, because she had never thought of herself as someone worth being noticed. Then the chief asked something that surprised her more than anything else he had said. He asked if anyone had ever given her a real opportunity. Clara answered honestly that she did not think so. He nodded slowly and said that charity fills a day, but opportunity can change a life. One of the younger riders dismounted and stepped forward carrying a small folded bundle. He handed it to the chief, who then offered it to Clara. Inside was a simple but well-made wool shawl, thick enough for winter, dyed a deep earth color. Clara hesitated again, unsure if accepting it would change something she did not yet understand. The chief explained that this was not payment. It was a sign that she would always be welcome to walk their land without fear. A sign of trust. Clara accepted it carefully this time, not because she wanted something, but because refusing respect felt different than refusing reward. The chief then asked his final question of that morning, his voice almost gentle now, asking not what she wanted, but what kind of future she believed she deserved. The question seemed too large for someone like her. Clara took a long breath before answering. She said she had never thought about what she deserved, only about what she could survive. The chief studied her for a moment longer, and then said quietly that sometimes surviving was only the beginning of a much longer story. And as the sun climbed higher over the quiet town, it became clear to everyone watching that this meeting had never been about a ring, but about recognizing the rare kind of person who does right even when no one is watching. Clara held the wool shawl carefully against her arms as if she was afraid it might disappear if she gripped it too tightly. And for the first time since her parents had died, she felt the unfamiliar weight of being seen not as someone to overlook, but as someone to consider. The chief stepped back slightly then, giving her space as if to show that whatever came next would be her choice and not his command. He told her that his people were preparing for the coming winter and that they often needed careful hands more than strong ones, people who noticed small details, people who could repair what others overlooked. Clara listened without speaking, unsure why he was telling her this. He explained that there was work she could do if she wished, mending blankets, helping prepare supplies, learning skills that would always mean she would never have to depend on luck alone again. Clara felt the words settle slowly inside her, because no one had ever offered her something that sounded like a future instead of just another day. Across the street, a few townspeople whispered that she should refuse, that accepting anything from outsiders would only bring trouble, but none of them had ever offered her a chance themselves. Clara asked quietly what would be expected of her. The chief answered simply that she should be exactly who she already was. Honest, careful, willing to learn. Nothing more. Nothing less. The simplicity of that answer seemed to remove the last of her fear. He then did something unexpected. Instead of offering his hand like a man of authority, he placed his palm briefly over his own heart, a gesture of respect rather than ownership. Clara understood enough to nod in return. One of the riders brought forward a small canvas satchel filled with basic sewing tools, good needles, strong thread, pieces of clean cloth. Practical things. Not gifts meant to impress, but tools meant to build something. Clara accepted them slowly, understanding that this was not charity. This was trust. The chief then said that she did not need to decide immediately. That dignity meant having the freedom to choose her own path. Clara looked back at her small weathered house, the broken step, the empty woodpile, the narrow life she understood, then back at the quiet line of riders who had arrived not with demands but with respect. She said she would like to try, not because she was desperate, but because she wanted to become someone stronger than her circumstances. The chief gave a small nod, as if that was the answer he had hoped she would reach on her own. As he turned to return to his horse, he paused and said one last thing, not loudly, but clearly enough for Clara to carry with her long after the riders were gone. He said that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept a chance they did not expect. Then he mounted his horse, and with a quiet signal the riders began to move, not fast, not dramatic, just a steady turning back toward the open land, leaving behind something invisible but permanent. Clara stood there holding the satchel and the shawl, the morning sun warming her face, and for the first time she realized that kindness does not always return as a reward. Sometimes it returns as a door. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared beyond the rise of the prairie, their silhouettes growing smaller until they became part of the horizon itself, and the town remained unusually quiet, as if everyone understood they had witnessed something they did not fully understand. Clara remained standing where she was long after the last hoofbeat faded, her fingers resting on the rough canvas of the sewing satchel, as if she needed to feel something real to be sure the morning had actually happened. Eventually, the normal sounds of the town began to return, a hammer striking metal at the blacksmith shop, a wagon creaking toward the feed store, voices speaking a little louder than usual as people tried to pretend everything was ordinary again. But it was not. For the first time, when Clara walked down the street, people did not look past her. Some nodded. Some simply watched. Even Mr. Hargrove gave her a longer look than usual before placing a small loaf of yesterday bread on his counter and telling her she could take it without paying. Clara thanked him but left 2 small copper coins anyway, because she wanted to keep standing the way she had learned to stand. That afternoon she packed the few things she owned, a second dress, a tin cup, a small photograph of her parents worn pale by years of handling, and as the sun lowered she wrapped the new shawl around her shoulders and began the long walk back toward the cottonwood line where the prairie changed character. The distance felt shorter this time, not because the miles had changed, but because her purpose had. When she reached the first trees, she found someone waiting, not the chief, but the younger rider who had brought the sewing tools earlier. He greeted her with a quiet nod and offered to walk beside her the rest of the way. They did not speak much. Words did not seem necessary. As they walked, she noticed signs she had missed before, small gardens carefully tended near the lodges, children carrying water, elders working hides with patient hands, a community built not on noise but on shared effort. She was shown a small place where she could sleep, simple but clean, and given work that same evening repairing a torn winter coat. Her hands moved carefully, each stitch steady, each repair bringing a quiet sense of worth she had never felt from simply surviving another day. No one praised her loudly. No one treated her like a stranger either. They simply included her. As the firelight flickered against the canvas walls that night, Clara understood something she had never been taught, but somehow always hoped was true. Respect did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like this. Quiet. Earned. Given without conditions. And as she finished her first piece of work and set the needle down beside the thread, she realized that for the first time since she could remember, she was not wondering how she would get through tomorrow. She was beginning to wonder who she might become if she did. Winter arrived slowly across the prairie the way it always did, not with sudden storms, but with longer shadows, colder mornings, and the smell of wood smoke carried for miles across the open land. And Clara found herself rising before sunrise each day with a purpose that felt as steady as the needle between her fingers. Weeks passed, and her work became known not because she spoke about it, but because every coat she repaired lasted longer, every blanket she mended held stronger, every careful stitch telling a quiet story about patience. The elders began trusting her with more difficult repairs, delicate beadwork, ceremonial cloth, things that required not only skill but respect. Clara never rushed. She treated every piece as if it belonged to someone she cared about. One afternoon, as the first thin snow settled along the edges of the camp, the chief returned from a long journey and stopped beside the work table where she sat. He watched her for a moment before speaking, not interrupting, simply observing the way she finished a seam before looking up. He asked her if she was finding what she needed. Clara answered that she was learning something more important than what she needed. She said she was learning what she could give. The chief nodded slowly, the same quiet approval in his eyes as before. He then placed something small on the table beside her hand. The same silver ring, now hanging from the braided cord. Clara looked at it, but did not reach for it. He told her that among his people such a ring was sometimes carried by those who had proven they understood the meaning of trust, not because they were born into it, but because they had chosen it when it would have been easier not to. Clara asked softly why he believed she deserved such a thing. The chief answered that deserving was not the right word. He said the right word was becoming. He explained that character was not something a person claimed. It was something they practiced when no one promised to notice. Clara finally accepted the ring, not as a treasure but as a reminder. She tied it carefully inside her shawl where it rested close to her heart, unseen but never forgotten. That evening, as the sky turned deep blue and the first stars appeared over the silent plains, Clara stood outside the lodge and watched the firelight flicker against the snow. Children ran past her laughing. Someone called her name to help with a torn glove. For the first time, the sound of her own name did not feel temporary. It felt like it belonged somewhere. She understood then that the greatest change had not been the place she lived or the work she did. The greatest change was that she no longer felt like someone the world had passed by. Out here, where the wind erased footprints by morning and a person was measured by what they did when life was hardest, a quiet truth had found her. Kindness given without expectation does not return as fortune. It returns as belonging. And sometimes that is worth more than anything silver could ever buy.